Welcome to Pandas Nightmares. In today's video, you will hear heart-wrenching spooky stories from the oceans and seas. If you haven't already, do subscribe to my channel. And if you do like my video, hit the like button. Thank you in advance, and now let's get started. Story 1. Giant spears plunging in and out of the sea. Lol. In the Gulf of Alaska, I have seen some shit. But one of the most terror-inspiring things I've seen are what can happen with some of the loose logs from the logging trade. Sometimes when a big log gets loose from a raft, it becomes partially waterlogged and floats small end up. So you have this 4-foot diameter telephone pole in the sea, sticking up 40 feet into the air. No biggie, shows up on radar and easy to spot. Now, give that pole 20 years of floating around or so. It rots in such a way that it becomes filed to a point by wind and waves and looks quite menacing. Now, put it in a gale with 25-foot waves, 50 feet trough to peak, ... and it becomes a towering spike of death that shoots up from the sea every 15 to 20 minutes, out of nowhere, 60 feet into the air, only to plunge down into the dark depths, waiting to skewer some unsuspecting boat in a few minutes when it thrusts out of the ocean again. It is a genuine terrifying sight, rare, but not so rare that I haven't seen two in one season. It's like the spiked dick of Neptune looking for an opportunity to fuck your shit up in a particularly terrifying way. Story 2. I worked on tugboats for about 6 years. The back deck is considered a wet deck, meaning it isn't unusual for it to be underwater at times. We were making tow with an oil rig at sea with waves that were 14 to 16 and one hitters just right. Taking my co-worker George and pulling him out to sea. Now it's 3 a.m. and pitch black. This is nearly always a death sentence. About 20 seconds later, which felt like an eternity, another wave brought George back on deck, plopping him safely on his ass, right next to the winch. George laughed and got right back to work without missing a beat. Story 3. Worked the shrimp boats in the Gulf back in the 70s. 100 miles off the coast of Louisiana, and the sea got dead calm. I mean dead calm, not a ripple or a swell. The sea was so calm that vibrations from the engine idling would make little ripples in the water. The surface of the sea looked like a huge never-ending mirror extending out in all directions. The visual memory I have of seeing that perfectly flat sea in the moonlight is deeply etched in my memory, and I can see it today in my mind just as real as if it was happening now. I could talk about 25-foot seas in the middle of a hurricane, or a half-dozen waterspouts dancing around us during a summer squall, or sargassum seaweed as far as the eye could see, so thick around the boat that you could walk on it. All flying fish, all taking flight at the same time, like a flock of birds skimming across the water. But none of that stuff had the impact on me like the dead calm of the sea 100 miles offshore. Story 4. A couple of years ago, I was sailing as a cadet on a merchant vessel, and I was scheduled on the evening watch. The rest of the crew was enjoying dinner, and I was to call if anything went wrong. We were sailing over open ocean, no land within a day sailing around us, and all of a sudden I notice an island coming up on my bow. It was still far away, but it shouldn't be there. I looked at the maps, checked my position multiple times, and then I noticed the island did not appear on my radars. I called down to the mess room to tell there was a weird island in front of us. The chief mate came up and checked again the maps and positions. He also noticed that the radars did not see the island. We called the captain, and when he came up, he started laughing. He was an old sailor with over 40 years of experience under his belt. He explained us it was a Fata Morgana. The real island was more than a day sailing away in the direction we were heading at that moment. After that incident, he took over the watch, and I went down. It wasn't really creepy, but it was strange. Story 5. I'm not sure this is exactly what you're looking for, but I spent several years as a mechanic on an aircraft carrier. Every single one of us in my division had stories like this. I was on watch in the propulsion plant while we were in port, so I was the only one in there. I saw a sailor I didn't recognize rounding a corner, so I hurried over to challenge him. Most people on the ship weren't authorized to be down there. When I got around the corner, there was nobody there. Another time I saw a large, heavy, bolted down water tank move itself a foot or so. I sat down on the deck and just stared at it for like 20 minutes until I came to my senses. Despite being legitimately spooked by this stuff, we pretty much all agreed that we were hallucinating due to exhaustion and compounding fatigue. Not that the plant was haunted or anything, but who knows, maybe it was. Story 6. Not sure if it's considered creepy, but kind of unnerving. I was active duty Navy for 4 years, based on a destroyer out of Japan. I'd say I'd seen it all, but this story really stuck with me. We were put in Iran when we get a distress call from a cargo ship about 100 miles or so away. It wasn't them in distress but another boat, and they were relaying it out to get some help. We responded, met up with the cargo ship en route. There was something cool about that. A US Navy warship meeting up a cargo vessel from like Australia or somewhere to rescue some Thai fishermen. By time we got on scene, another ship was there and was doing circles, looking for the crew. We found the fishing vessel about 90% submerged underwater, only the bow was still above the water. Unfortunately, we were not able to find any crew members. We found a few empty flotation devices, but no crew. We stayed on scene looking around for a few hours, even sending out our choppers. Ultimately, we had to call it, as we had another prior mission to take care of. We left the cargo ship and another ship to look, but really, I don't think either of them found anything. To this day, I'm not sure what caused that fishing boat to sink. And it's sad to see the boat, but no crew. Story 7. My granddad's brother, great-uncle, was in the Navy for the majority of his life. I loved when he'd visit because he'd always tell me cool stories. Most were just of storms or cool things that have happened to him, but one stuck with me. He was in the North Sea, and it was a particularly bad storm. He and his friends were convinced they saw Viking longships. He was ridiculed every time he brought it up, but he never faltered from his story. No big flashy event, or anything other than a group of around a dozen Viking longboats rowing through the storm. He told it way better, but to this day, I believe him. It's the only time he ever mentioned anything even slightly creepy like that. Story 8. I was serving on a Coast Guard vessel in the Barents Sea in the late 1990s. This is an area very rich with fish, so a big part of the Coast Guard's job in the area was policing, rescuing, and inspecting fishing ships. The closest coastline to the Barents Sea is the Russian Kola Peninsula, so the majority of the fishing vessels there were Russian. One day, while patrolling the area, we noticed a fishing ship moving in a strange pattern. Usually the trawlers would move like in a herd, following the fish stems. But this vessel would keep moving in and out of the fleet, and often moving up right next to other ships in the fleet, before moving out again. This seemed to us as very strange behavior for a fishing ship, so we decided to send out a boarding party to inspect the vessel. I was on this party. When we came aboard, to our surprise, there were no fishing equipment on the deck, and it didn't seem like the boat had been trawling at all. Still, we had to do a proper inspection and see what was in the cargo. When we moved inside the boat, we noticed that a lot of the lights inside the boat was changed to red, and there was a smell of old booze and sweat, instead of the normal smell of fish. We came into the cargo hold. It was even stranger when the cargo hold also turned out to be empty, so they were not supplying the fleet or taking their catch to shore. On our way up to the bridge, we suddenly figured out what was going on. One of the crew lugers had no door, and the bunk beds inside were filled with scantily dressed Russian girls. It turned out it was a floating brothel, servicing the fishermen out at sea. This might not seem as much to some, but to an 18-year-old Norwegian it made me realize how good my life was, compared to these people living across the border, especially considering both the girls and the fishermen were around my own age. Story 9. This is not me, but my father, who was commercial sailor from the 50s to the 70s. He was on tanker crossing the Pacific Ocean. They were far from land and kind of in the middle of the ocean. The Pacific Ocean is big, very big, so the chance of meeting other vessels out there is very slim. Still, one night, when it was completely dark, dots started to appear on the radar. This was in the 60s, so radar technology wasn't close to what it is today. So my father went out to the bridge wing to see if he could see any lanterns. Nothing. When he came back to the bridge, he saw that the radar were now completely covered with dots all around the ship. Big dots too, but still not a single lantern in sight. My father thought it must be a malfunction or some weather causing it. Still, the water was flat and weather seemed calm, so he made a call on the radio for any ships in the area. Immediately, he got an answer from an American voice. It turned out he had managed to cross paths with an American carrier group on maneuver in the middle of the Pacific. He then requested if they could turn their lights on so he could maneuver safely out of their fleet. Suddenly, within a few seconds, as he described it, it was like a whole city marshalized out of the darkness around them. From horizon to horizon, there were huge carriers, supply ships, escort ships, and whatnot. The contrast of being alone in the vast ocean for days to this was very strange. He managed to maneuver the tanker through the myriad of ships, and when he came to the outskirts of the fleet, suddenly, as soon as they appeared, the whole fleet went completely dark again. Gone. Once again, the ship was totally alone in the vast dark ocean. He described the encounter as the strangest feeling he experienced during 30 years at sea. Story 10. Not my story, but a bit of maritime lore that was told to me when I was a young boy. Anyways, as the story goes, in the 1700s, in the dead of winter off the coast of North Carolina, there was a merchant ship trying to find safety from a winter ice storm bearing down upon them. But thanks to the condition of the storm, they couldn't find a port or cove to shelter in, so they had no choice but to weather out the storm. So they climbed the rigging and tied themselves into it so they wouldn't get tossed by the gnarly bucking waves or the icy gales. They didn't dare go below deck in the event of the ship capsizing or sinking. A few days went by, the ship didn't show up, so people walked the shores of the outer banks, looking for them, only to find the ship run up on the shore with over a dozen men still standing in the rigging. The search team called out, but they received no response, so they climbed aboard the grounded ship, only to find the men still standing frozen solid, hanging onto the rigging of that ship in a way only the dead can. Story 11. Not a sailor, and I wasn't on the ocean, but on a cliff overlooking the water. It was California, and I was traveling with my family for a road trip, so we decided to stop and see the views. The parking area was blocked off from the view by trees, and we had to take a trail to see the views. Me and my brother, aged 19 and 15, decided that we would run all of the way there, but my brother is faster than me, so I lost sight of him on this extremely steep downward slope. I came to a fork in the trail, but I didn't know which words he went, and I didn't receive an answer when I called his name. I went right and followed the trail all the way down to a cliff, at least 50 meters above the water, still calling his name, and still he didn't respond. Looking down, there were jagged rocks in the water below, so falling was a guaranteed death sentence. The wind picked up, and I had to actually press myself against the rocks to stop it from pushing me over the edge. It continued to get faster and faster, but then suddenly stopped. I don't know how, but the air went completely still and I heard a faint voice of a little girl, maybe around 5 or 6, crying and screaming like she was terrified of something. There was nobody else around me, and there was no other voice that I heard, so I started calling for the little girl. She very clearly started calling out, "Mama, Mama, I'm scared." And I followed her voice to this slightly jutting shelf that started to lead down the cliff. The rocks were covered in sand and were slightly damp, so I knew it was dangerous, but I continued on anyways. Maybe only 6 meters down, there was a sharp 90-degree turn against the cliff. That I couldn't see around, but my instincts were telling me to get back. I slowed but still inched my way to this turn, and looking over was a perfectly vertical drop into the ocean below. If I took even one more normal-sized step, my foot would have stepped right over. I still looked around to see if there really was a little girl somewhere, but there was nowhere she could have hidden. So I went back up. I could still hear her voice, and it sounded so close to me, but I couldn't see her. My brother eventually caught up with me, since he went down the left trail, and the voice stopped. Upon asking him if he saw anyone or heard the voice, he just shook his head. Creepiest experience I ever had with the ocean. Story 12. I'm not a sailor, but my dad was in the Navy for 30 years. He enlisted in 1944. He told me a story that's always fascinated me. He said they had been tracking a German submarine when suddenly the sub breached the water. He said they immediately surrendered. When the men got on board their ship, they were all old, way past the age of an enlisted man. They told them their ages, and they ranged from 18 to 43. But these men were obviously elderly. Dad said some of the men died that night. The doctor aboard said they died from old age, natural causes. He said they were put in the bunks and kept there until they were transferred to a carrier. Dad said they weren't told anything about the men or what happened to them. In 1984, I went to a Navy reunion with him in San Francisco. After all the introductions and a few drinks, one of his shipmates says, "Well, who wants to know what happened to those men?" Then says they were given experimental drugs that were supposed to open up areas of our dormant brain. That in fact it worked, but rapidly increased aging. He said they all died within a week, and the oldest was 43. Crazy stuff. Story 13. One of my co-workers fled to the US from Vietnam in a small boat as a young child. She was one of the boat people. We were complaining about little shit when she explained why she almost never got upset. She was only 7 when this happened. She and her sister, father, mother, and grandfather were in a small fishing boat in the middle of the ocean. They had been out of food for several days. She and her sister 5 managed to catch an albatross on the boat. Her father said it was bad luck to kill one and released it. She said as she watched it fly away, she knew then that she and her family were going to starve to death. She hated her father at that point too. The next day they were picked up by a trawler and taken to California. She still wears an albatross necklace for good luck. Story 14. US Navy submariner for 10 years. One time I fell asleep on the sub, which there is very little time for, and I was so exhausted I dreamt of what I would later tell my friend, the dreamfish. The dreamfish attaches itself to our sub when we dive deep enough, and uses some kind of brainwave ability to influence our dreams and read our thoughts, during which we fully realize and understand that the fish is influencing our dreams. It even communicated, I dreamed, not through words, just like ... emotional suggestions. It was the craziest, weirdest dream I have ever had. Now, I fully believe this is not a real thing, but I've had subsequent dreamfish dreams. Only when we were below a certain depth. I'd wake up and figure out what depth we were at during my time of sleep, which I wouldn't have bothered to know before sleeping. Does this fish exist? Probably not. Fall asleep beneath the ocean waves and see if it finds you, as well. Story 15. Dad and grandparents all lived on a boat. We are from southern part of China, so when I say boat, I mean those huge-ass ones from back in the days, like pirate ships, big. Family of 18 lived on this boat. They would fish back and forth from China to Vietnam, now known as the parts where China is trying to take over from other countries and built a man-made islands. Anyways, Dad said sirens, aka people in the water singing to lure you in, are real. He said he and others has seen or heard them. It's how my eldest aunt drowned, according to him. My other aunts also said that's how she drowned, but never actually gave out a story. They all knew each other's voices, and if they heard singing that didn't sound like any of them, they knew to cover their ears and head back down below. Thus the banging on the pots and pans to scare them away. They even went to get fireworks to scare them away. Sometimes they would have a high-pitched scream. They tried everything to get rid of it. They even thought throwing fish back into the water would be an offering, but that didn't work. When my aunt drowned, my grandfather became a more abusive alcoholic. My dad said many times he thought of pushing his dad over and just blamed it on the sirens, but was too scared what my grandpa would do if he'd survived the fall into the water. I've asked about this story so many times, but it never ever changes. When stories don't change, you know there's truth. And when everyone else's account of the same story that's also the same, then you know it's the truth. They all said they heard or seen it. Just a person in the water, when there shouldn't be anyone else. They hadn't looked like they were in distress. More so that they were just taking a nice relaxing swim, and that you should be in there with them. They made the water seem so enticing. Yup, that was my dad's story, my grandma's story, my mum's story, and even my grandpa's story. They all said the same thing. That is all for today. If you have enjoyed this video, do you like and subscribe? I post once a week or more. You can also subscribe to my Patreon below to support me. Hope you have an absolutely amazing day, and hope you'll check my other videos on screen.